right. Thank you again, Mark. That was great. If you would, please take your Bibles and turn to, once again, the book of Esther. Esther, chapter number 8. Esther, chapter number 8. Lord willing, we'll be closing out our study of Esther next week. That's my goal. And as many of you know, sometimes I have these goals and we do not meet them. So hopefully, Lord willing, we'll close everything down. And we'll close out our story of Esther. It's been, I know, at least for me, and I know many of you have told me it's probably one of the best series I think we've gone through. And not because of me, but it's, man, this story is just chock full of so many life principles. And it should not surprise me, but every time this happens, it does surprise me. It shouldn't, but why am I so surprised that the Bible, both the New Testament and the Old Testament, is just as applicable today as it was when it was written? And there are so many principles at play in Esther, even though it was written 1,500 years ago, or longer actually, 2,500 years ago, to our present day. Just quite remarkable. So I'm glad that many of you, I appreciate the notes that many of you have sent me. And I've been very encouraged by that. But as I said this morning, listen, this is not because pastor's a good preacher. Listen, if I can't preach Esther, I shouldn't be a preacher. It's just one of those books that preaches itself. But if you would, we'll continue our study of the book of Esther today in Esther chapter 8. I've actually entitled my message today, Revoking the Irrevocable. Revoking the irrevocable. So today we're going to answer that all-important question. What do you do when you are confronted with an impossible task? You have to pray for me and Emery. We have been trying now for what, babe? 2-3 weeks to potty train our youngest. And it is proving to be quite impossible. And he's doing pretty well, a combination of he is actually old enough to ask when he needs to go, but we've also set a timer for him to go. But despite those two, where he thinks and he knows he needs to go, and us setting a timer, he still has a problem with thinking, I have to use the restroom. Might I ask father and mother? Nah, I'll just go. And so it's definitely been a challenge, and we are both of us are kind of slated facing it, what we think is many times an impossible task, especially since he is going to school in the fall, and one requirement they have for us is that he must be potty trained. So there's also a time countdown on here, so you have to pray for us as we get this. But in Esther chapter 8, we are presented with an impossible task, right? Haman. There we go. Haman has been dispatched, okay? We read that last week. But his evil plans are still very much alive. They're still in play. Esther and Mordecai, as we can probably at least guess at this point, they're going to survive regardless. But what about their people? These are questions even the most well-educated at the time would have a hard time answering. But thankfully, Esther and Mordecai are unlike any who have come before. They are really smart, especially with Esther. She is wise and cunning, right? I wouldn't want to go toe-to-toe with Esther, would you? None of us would. She is a woman who is fully in control of herself and her surroundings, and she uses it for God's glory. But more than that, not only are Esther and Mordecai remarkable people, but they have God working for them in the background. And when God is for you, who can be against you? When God is for you, the impossible is made possible. Amen? So let's read. Let's talk about how the impossible is made possible. We got to fly through this passage today just to get to the application. But here we go. Esther chapter number 8, verse 1. On that day, the king Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. So in other words, it's the same day, same time. Everything that happened in chapter 7 happens here in chapter 8, same time frame. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had not told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Real quick, I want to get into the body of this, but I don't want you to miss, there's a ton packed into these two verses. One, it's a continuation of this reversal of fortunes. You got to see that, don't you? First, Esther is given the riches of the very man, Haman, who plotted to destroy her life. Right? The guy who was set to execute and kill Esther, all of his stuff was given to who? Esther. Second, Mordecai is then promoted to prime minister via the ring that Haman wore. I'm sorry, what was Haman? What position did he hold in Persia? Second in command. He was the prime minister, but now Mordecai is the prime minister. And what's more, and what's most remarkable, is that after Esther is given Haman's land, Esther gives Haman's land to who? Mordecai. Haman's house is given over to the one man Haman hated the most. That's a lot. What's more, Esther finally introduced Xerxes to Mordecai, right? Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what Mordecai, was to her, Esther. Now, this phrase means more than the familial bond that Esther and Mordecai had. If this was what the writer of Esther wanted, he could have simply used the Hebrew words for family or kinsfolk. Instead, the writer of Esther uses a much broader, much generic term to imply that their relationship, that is, the relationship between Esther and Mordecai, was something more than just shared bloodline. How many of you share bloodline with somebody, but you do not like them? Right? Just because they're relatives doesn't mean you like them. In fact, in many ways, it's evidence that you probably don't like them. So here, though, Mordecai is more than just Esther's cousin. As we discussed way back in week 3, my big gripe, my big complaint with the story of Esther is that if you watch it in theater, you watch the movies, when it comes to the story of Esther, a lot of times they will play up this love story between Xerxes and Esther, which isn't there. Do we like Xerxes? No. Was he a good man? No. Would any father want their daughter married to a man like Xerxes? No, 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 no. And there's probably another word that goes before that I can't say as a pastor. No, no, no. No. There's no reason. But the real story, the real love story in Esther is not between a man, King Xerxes, and Esther. The real love story is between a father and his daughter. It is a love story about how the father, more than anything, will go to extreme lengths, not to save necessarily his people, which he cares about his people, but will go to extraordinary lengths to save his only daughter. This is the story of Esther. And here is Esther telling the king, look, king, yes, Mordecai is my cousin, but he's so much more. Mordecai adopted Esther and raised her as his own. She was his daughter by choice, not by birth. Mordecai was also Esther's closest friend and confidant during that 4-year beauty pageant. We read about in Esther chapter 2 how every day for 4 years, Mordecai visited Esther and never once abandoned her. Mordecai was many things to many different people, but to Esther, Mordecai meant the whole world. How many of you are daddy's girls? You love your daddy so much. And it sounds weird for me to say that, right? Because it's like, whoa, right? But you are daddy's girl, right? You love your dad so much. This is the relationship that Queen Esther had with Mordecai. He was so much more, and she wanted to make it abundantly clear to Xerxes that this man was more important than anyone else to her. What's extraordinary is that this is the one and only time we see Xerxes acting of his own accord to promote Mordecai. Throughout the entire book of Esther, he always goes to his counselors and asks for advice. He can't make a decision, right? We laughed about that last week. He's going to the grocery store, and what is he going to get? 2-ply, 3-ply toilet paper? He doesn't know, so he's going to call Haman. He needed someone to help him make a choice about the smallest things. But here he is. He's listening to his wife, and here, without even thinking or asking anybody else, he just promotes Mordecai to be the prime minister. But even in this, we see a wise Esther, don't we? Because did she love Mordecai? Absolutely. And did Mordecai deserve to be the second in command? 100%. But I cannot help but think that Esther said all she did with not only the intention of revealing who Mordecai was to her, but also to get Xerxes to promote who? Mordecai. She knew she would need Mordecai's help if she was to succeed in revoking an irrevocable decree. Again, Esther is pretty wise, isn't she? I love this story. Let's continue reading. Then Esther spoke again to the king. So really, at this point, for the king, everything's done, right? It's like, hey, Esther, we chill. You know? It's kind of like when you're talking to your wife and you say, hey, what'd you get from the store? And she says this and this and this. And there's a pregnant pause. And you're like, and this and this and this. And this. And that. And there's other stuff in the car. So, and here the king thinks, hey, everything must be done. But then Esther, of her own accord, speaks up. And what happens? She fell at the king's feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And Esther said, notice, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if, I just added it there because it could go there, but if I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to what? Revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For she says, King, how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Verse 7, then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring for an edict, written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring. What? Cannot be revoked. Let's break down this passage and we'll close out the chapter. It bears mentioning that at this point, the king has had a very long day. If you remember, this is the same day which began for Xerxes tossing and turning. It's the same day. He hasn't had sleep. The same day in which he, tossing in sleep, tried to pick the most boring book he could find, only to find it read that he never once recognized someone who needed honoring. Who was that someone who needed honoring? Mordecai. And so he says, oh no, that's really offensive. Who's in the court? Just so happens to be who? Haman. Bring him in. Hey, Haman, you seem like you got something on your mind. Doesn't matter. I want you to go out here, get Mordecai, and parade him through the streets. Haman does that. And then, just as it's done, Haman is taken to the second banquet of Esther. And there, the king finally thinking, man, I can rest and relax and have a good meal with my wife and best buddy. Esther says, hey, king, your second in command is a traitor. I'm sorry, what? And then, Xerxes has Haman hanged. Yay! And then he says, hey, Esther, you can have all of Haman's stuff. I hear he's got a pretty killer boombox. We cool? Well, Esther's like, no, let me introduce you to my dad, who is technically your father-in-law. His name's Mordecai. Haman's like, the same dude who I just honored less than 12 hours before? Esther's like, yeah, the same one. Okay, seems like a pretty rad guy. Hey, Mordecai, why don't you be the prime minister? Yeah. So here is the king sitting on his throne, and he's like, it's getting kind of late, and I'm tired, kind of ready to go home. And then Esther speaks up once more. And not just speaks, she falls down on her what? Knees. He sees a show of emotion from her that he has not seen before. Now, she was upset. Last chapter we talked about that. But not weeping, not on her knees. The queen of Persia. And here, Xerxes is a little bit tired, you can imagine. And so Esther speaks again. And the narrator tells us that she not only spoke, but she fell on her knees weeping. And I want you to understand, this is not melodrama. This is real. The villain Haman was dead, sure, that much is true, but Haman's plot was still very much alive. And while Esther realizes that her adoptive father and herself would probably live, who wouldn't live? The Jews. This, to her, was totally unacceptable. And even though Esther had it all, do you see this? Esther had it all. She would survive, and her dad would survive. She was still the queen of Persia. She was actually in the best relationship she has ever been with her husband, the king. But did she care about any of it? No. She cared for none of it so long as the Jews were in jeopardy. So Esther, queen of Persia, gets on her hands and knees and begs for the life of her people. The situation was no less dire than when the banquet began. It was difficult enough. Think about this for Esther. It was difficult enough for Esther to convince Xerxes that his second in command was a traitor. That's a task in itself. It was harder still to convince Xerxes to revoke a decree that he himself decreed. And so here she just lays all pretense on the floor, and she begs for her people. This is why we see Esther couch her response, her request, in more formality and etiquette than we ever have before. 4 times she uses the if clause before saying what she wants. Why? Because she is deferring to the king. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times defers to the king. If it please the king, if I have found favor in your sight, if this thing seems right before you, and if I am pleasing to you, hear my request. Layer upon layer upon layer, the politeness and propriety of Middle Eastern custom is supposed to further persuade the king of the impossible. And what's the impossible? King, I want you to revoke a decree that is irrevocable. Since chapter 1, it has been well established that once a law in Persian has been decreed, it cannot be removed. Here Esther was asking for the very thing. Essentially, she said, void the law that Haman decreed, O husband. But notice she does not do so based on Xerxes' love for the Jews. Hey, church, did Xerxes like the Jews? No. Did he dislike them? No. He was kind of whatever. Indifferent, 100%. Thank you, Roger. He was indifferent, 100%. He had no love for the Jews. Did not care for the Jews in the least. Xerxes held no affection for the Israelites. Instead, rather than go for Xerxes' heart by saying, hey, Xerxes, you're about to be a king when genocide is promulgated throughout your empire. It's rather than that, she bases her plea on personal terms. Personal terms. Let me back up one slide. For how can what? She says, I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred. In other words, my king, she says, my king, my husband, you have acted before to save my life from the hand of Haman, and I am asking for you to do it again. Come to my aid and save me from the heartache that this decree will cause me. Esther tries to persuade Xerxes using his own affection for her. If you love me, king, if you really love me, you will not do this thing. You see the boldness now of Esther? Now, it would seem that when we read how the king responds, that it's a favorable one, as if he had been convinced by her arguments. But the reality is far from. His response is actually laden with exasperation. Remember we talked about this last chapter, how when Xerxes found out that Haman was a traitor, in the Hebrew it's very staccato, it's very biting, it's very quick. And here it's the same Hebrew phraseology. The king is exasperated. He says, I have given you Haman's house. I have even hanged Haman for you. His point in bringing this up is, what more do you want, woman? What more can I give you? He even flat out lies to her. Because he says he did these things because Haman intended to lay his hands on the Jews. That's a lie. Did Xerxes care about the Jews? Did Xerxes hang Haman because he was trying to protect the Jews? He hung Haman because he was trying to protect his honor. He was selfish. Like all politicians, Xerxes, when confronted with his own mistakes, wanted to rewrite history. How many of us have heard politicians get up and say, hey, listen, I know you all saw this on the news, but it really wasn't like that. He tried to spin events in such a way that keeps him from admitting that he had a hand in Haman's plot too. Thus, when Xerxes says, this is emphatic. He intended to lay hands on the Jews. And then he says this, that is Mordecai and Esther, not me, not us, not we, you may write as you please concerning the Jews in the name of the king, and you may seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. What he means that this is your problem, wife, not mine. You have the same ring Haman did. And you have the same authority that Haman did. And you can write whatever you want, but I will not help you. Do we like Xerxes? Yeah, for real, man. Essentially, Xerxes was both distancing himself from Esther's cause, but washing his hands of the matter. As far as he was concerned, he had done everything he could. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad that when politicians do everything they can, we can still rely upon God? That even when a man cannot see a way through, aren't you happy that God makes a way anyways? For though Xerxes was not smart enough to reverse an irreversible law, guess who was? Esther, Mordecai, and God. You ready? Let's continue reading. But the king's scribes were summoned. You see the but there? It's like Xerxes was like, I'm done. And it really, at that point, maybe we should just end the story. But the story goes on, doesn't it? But the king's scribe were summoned at the time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivian, on the 23rd day. That's roughly 70 days after the initial decree. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews to these satraps and the governors and the officials of the province from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. Quick fact here. Esther, chapter number 8, verse 9, is the longest verse in the Bible. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And here, the point is this, that the new decree gets dispersed throughout the empire, and it's not just the Persians who the decree is written in, their law, their language, but also who? The Jews. The Jews are also, the decree is also promulgated, promoted throughout the land in the Jews' language and in the Jews' script. And what happens? What is Mordecai and what is Esther's solution to an irrevocable law? Here it is. And he wrote in the name of the king, Xerxes, sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then Mordecai sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed. If you have Bibles and you underline, I encourage you to underline these words, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to not only what? Gather, but what? Defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or any province that might attack them, children and women included. Ooh. And to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the province of King Xerxes on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is in the month Adar. And a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Let's break this down. What do you do when a law legalizes force against a particular people group? What do you do when the law says you can kill a people group within our country? Here's what you do. You make a law that allows that very same people group to defend themselves. You see, the Jews weren't allowed to defend themselves before. They were now. This is a classic example of the shield and spear paradox. What happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force? We're going to learn from the chapter 9, catastrophe and bloodshed. That's what happens. But the point is that those of Haman's ilk were the unstoppable force. They were the spear that was headed straight for the lives of the Jews. Before Mordecai's decree, the Jews were not even allowed to defend themselves. Now, however, while the Jews were not permitted to attack, now they were not permitted to go on the offense, they were allowed to gather and protect themselves. They were now the unstoppable force. They were the shield. Now, let's talk about something that's very uncomfortable in this passage, and I think you all kind of got it. Copy of back up, one more. The Jews were in every city to gather, defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any force of any people or any province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. Now, because Mordecai's law had to parallel Haman's law in every single point, or the Jews would be exposed to attack, this also meant that force was not only permitted against men who would attack the Jews, but also against women and children. Does that sit well with anybody this morning? No. Now, we should be rightly repulsed by such a law. And you're wondering, maybe this morning, how could Haman decree that? Why would he then go after the women and children? But let me remind you, this verbiage is not Mordecai's, but whose? Haman's. For Haman, if they were Jewish, he had every intention of killing every man, woman, and child. Haman, not Mordecai, wanted to see the blood of Israelite women and children run red in the streets, not Mordecai. But what do you do when there's a law permitting the slaughter of your own women and children? What do you do? As we've already stated, Mordecai's decree actually did not permit the Jews to attack without cause. It only legalized defense. That's why I told you to underline that in your Bibles. It allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and what? Attack? No, defend. Meaning every Jew would be allowed to defend themselves from every kind of threat, even if that threat was wielded by a child or a woman. Now, this is uncomfortable, isn't it? No one wants to talk or think about the idea of child soldiers. Nobody. But these are the facts. And one need only look at our own wars to see how women and children are actually a genuine threat, aren't they? Vile men in almost every conflict have used women and children as ammunition. My dad was in Vietnam, and he's told me stories that will curl your hair. For instance, tiny gorillas, which were children as young as 13, were used in armed conflict by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. Child soldiers as young as 13. Sadly, this trend actually continues today. You think, well, that was Vietnam. That doesn't happen today, right? There aren't people in our world who would take children and give them a gun and go attack their enemies. Surely not today. Actually, 40% of all child soldiers globally in active service are on the continent of Africa today. Why do I bring this up? Because I read a couple commentaries today and listened to a couple people preaching, and they try to take the teeth out of what this says. That, hey, listen, I know you're reading this in your Bible, but that's not really what it says. No, that's really what it says. Mordecai sent a decree to the world that said, listen, if you come attack us, even if it's a child or a woman, we will defend ourselves. Mordecai's decree was more a warning to all rather than a threat to all. Mordecai was not telling the Persians that the Jews were coming after the women and children. No, he wasn't telling them that. Instead, he said that if the Persians came for the Jews were permitted to defend themselves from every kind of threat. We see this play out and how only men are listed among the deceased in chapter 9. Spoiler alert, I know we're going to talk about this next week in our close, but we actually get to read about this battle, what happens at the end of this year. And only men are listed amongst those who were killed by the Jews. What's more, while the spoils of war would have been theirs, you saw it in the decree, Mordecai permitted, hey, listen, if you come attack the Jews, not only can they respond and defend themselves, even if it's a child or a woman attacking them, they can also take your stuff. But in Esther chapter number 9, we do not see a Jew kill a child or a woman, and we do not see a Jew spoil or take or plunder from their enemies. If they did not even take from their enemies that which would have been lawfully theirs, I doubt they would have killed their enemies, women and children, right? And it's true. But what is this lesson, right? And this is just extra today. Oftentimes, when you do evil against another, that evil reciprocates back, doesn't it? It echoes back. We talked about that last week. You throw a rock in a pond, and the rippling not only goes outward, but it also what? Comes back at you. And we saw in Esther chapter 7 how Haman got his comeuppance, didn't he? But oftentimes when you engage in activities that are unlawful or that are hurtful or that are vindictive, you not only hurt yourself, you hurt who? Those with you. Haman exposed his own family, his own wife, his own children, his cousins, and everybody else to attack simply because he was a vindictive and vile human being. So now you wonder, hold on, Pastor, how does the Persians respond? Right? If you got this tweet or on Facebook or you heard this law on a Monday morning and you heard that the Jews all of a sudden can now defend themselves and kill people, including women and children, and take their goods. If you heard that, how do you think you would respond? Woo, you would back off for sure. But you would be maybe a little bit like, I'm kind of scared here. It's the purge, literally, is coming. What are we going to do? But how does Persia respond? Let's continue reading. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa, not Jews, the city of Susa, what? Shouted and rejoiced. The Jews themselves had light, gladness, joy, and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was what? Gladness and joy among the Jews. Not only that, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So rather than be terrified, they were terrified of the Jews, fearful of the Jews. But rather than run from the Jews, they all went to the Jews' cause. Again, we see the continuation of this theme of reversals in these verses. Mordecai, who in chapter 4 put on sackcloth and ashes, is here robed and clothes of linen colored in purple and blue and white, and then given a golden crown. He was wearing raven's colors. Right? He was there. He went out. He was in chapter 4 in sackcloth and ashes, and here he came out with a jersey on. The Jews who mourned and fasted and wept and lamented are shown to be glad and joyful while feasting and making the day a holiday. Made it a national holiday. And lastly, the city of Susa, which was thrown in confusion by Haman's decree at the end of Esther chapter 3, is here shouting and rejoicing at Mordecai's decree and promotion. Xerxes, if you remember, Xerxes had to decree that everyone had to bow before Haman. Right? And we talked about this when it happened. He had to do this because nobody wanted to bow before Haman. No one liked Haman. Boo. Right? But here, Xerxes did not have to decree that when it came to Mordecai. Everyone just shouted and rejoiced. Everyone liked Mordecai. Yay. What's more, the narrator tells us that many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, this can mean one of two things, and I could be persuaded either way, though I'm leaning against the latter. The first explanation is that many Persians converted, both ethnically and religiously, to Judaism. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that many Persians simply aligned themselves with the Jews without totally converting to Judaism. Now, considering that Mordecai's moniker as the Jew, this seems more of an ethnic designation rather than a religious one. I think the latter is more the case. Do I think a bunch of Persians converted to Judaism? The answer, I don't think so. You can argue, that's fine. We can maybe talk about this later. This is not a hill I'm going to die on. But I don't think so. I think the more likely thing is that they simply identified themselves with the Jews and their cause. This is substantiated by the fact that a fear, not just a reverence, but a fear of the Jews had descended upon the populace. They would not go against a force that seemed to them to be unbeatable. A Jew, after all, was the second most powerful man in the country. And if you can't beat them, join them. So what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? Man, I've been itching to get here. I promise not to belabor this point. I love this point. Hear me. Things that are impossible with man are made possible with God. Church, I want you to say this with me on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Things that are impossible with man are made possible with God. Esther and Mordecai were up against an impossible task, right? Revoke the irrevocable. And while technically speaking, did they revoke the irrevocable? No. What did they do? They nullified it. As we'll see, there's still some bloodshed to come. And we're not going to relish in the bloodshed. I like a good action movie, but I only like a good action movie because it's all fantasy. No way do I ever want to be in an action movie that is real, right? I like Rambo, but I never, ever want to be in a real-life Rambo scenario. Sorry, right? If I am, I'm on Rambo's side. So while we're not going to relish next week in that bloodshed, the truth is people still died from this. But God, using Esther and Mordecai, God gave his people a fighting chance. I love this story in Mark 9. There's a lot of commotion going on. The disciples are trying to do their best. They're young. They're in their first year of ministry with Jesus. And they come up against a brick wall, something that seems impossible. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with the disciples. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to Jesus and greeted Jesus. And he asked them, Jesus asked these people, what's the commotion? What's going on? What are you arguing about with them? And one of the disciples from the crowd said, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. Not only that, not only can he not talk, when this spirit seizes him, this demon throws my son down. And my son begins to foam and grind his teeth, and he even becomes like a stone, rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they were not able. Imagine someone coming to the church, coming for the people who are supposed to know Jesus and who are supposed to help, and they fail. Jesus, your disciples, they couldn't help my son. My son. Your disciples couldn't help my son. And Jesus answered them. What does Jesus say? Oh, faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? We know at this point it was only a couple more years to the cross. How long, Jesus says, am I to bear with you? Sound familiar? Bring him. Hey, he looks at this father. Bring me your son. And they brought the boy to him. And the spirit saw Jesus and immediately convulsed the boy. That Greek phrase is literally like the demon took the little boy and started to thrash him about. And he fell on the ground and rolled about in front of everybody. And the boy's mouth started to foam. What does Jesus do? And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And you can almost hear in the Father's voice, from childhood. My son has been like this from childhood. And almost as if, Jesus, I've tried everything I can do. I've taken him to every single physician, every single rabbi, now to your disciples, and no one can help me. And in his off, he says, cast my poor boy into a fire and into water to kill my only son. But if you can do anything, have compassion on not just me, he says, have compassion on us and help us. How many of you have ever been to that point? The only one who can help you, the church has failed you, a pastor has failed you, your family members have failed you, and the only person you can go to is Jesus Christ. And Jesus looks at this father and he says, if you can what? Believe. He says, all things are possible for one who believes. And how does the father respond? Immediately, as the words were leaving Jesus' lips, the father of the child cries out, I believe! Help my unbelief. You think that's a paradox? Did he believe or didn't he believe? The answer is yes. How many of you will say today that you believe, but you have doubts in your heart? The disciples had doubts even at the very end in Matthew 28. Oftentimes when you walk a life of faith, you are choosing to walk by faith, but inside you doubt still. And here's this father saying, God, I believe, but I don't think it's enough. Jesus, I don't think you understand. My son has been like this his entire life. I've gone to everybody I can. I have no more belief to give. Help my unbelief. And Jesus says, that's enough. You just need a mustard seed, don't you? Just a little bit. Verse 25, and when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he immediately rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. What a powerful being as Jesus to be able to command demons. And what happens? After crying out and convulsing him terribly, this demon was not going to go lightly, is it? It wasn't going to go quietly into the night. It finally came out of him. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said he's dead. But Jesus took the boy by the hands. Isn't that sweet? I love walking in at night and seeing my son and my daughter asleep, because they're so peaceful when they're asleep and not screaming. One thing I love to do is I love to take the hand of my son or my daughter in my hand and just feel their little hand. Because I know it's not going to be little for long. And it's that, what I would call that sleepy hand. You know what I'm talking about? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? The hands just feel different when you're awake. When a child is sleeping, they have that really soft hand. And here's this little boy, he's finally for the first time getting a good nap. For the first time in his life. And Jesus takes his little hand and lifted him up. And what does it say? The boy arose. Doesn't that give you chills this morning? And when he had entered the house, so this is after some time. Can you imagine? I wish Mark told us, what did the father do after that? What did he do? We don't know. But some time passed, and we're back at a house later that night. And when Jesus had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And Jesus said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting. Hear me. Hear me this morning. A failure in this life stems from a failure to believe. Hey, I don't know what impossible task you are up against. I don't know what impossible task you are up against, but my God is bigger than your problems. My God is the God of the impossible. Jesus says if we had put the faith of a grain of mustard seed into our life, we could move mountains. Now, this does not excuse us from working and doing our part. If anything, Esther proves to us that while, yes, God is providential, He is sovereign, He is in control, and yes, He can orchestrate the plans of our life, but we still have a responsibility. We are still given agency, free will in our life, and we must do what we can, and God will make up the difference. God will not fill our ditches with water if we do not first dig the trenches. But when we are confronted with a problem or challenge that is bigger than us, we must do all that we can and leave the rest to God. This is what it means to walk by faith. When we are up against the impossible, we must leave it up to God to do the impossible. When we have done what we possibly can, we must leave it into the hands of the one who does the impossible. And for those who've walked this life, many of you are looking at me nodding like this. I know exactly what you mean, Pastor. Some of you are like, huh? But for those in here who know exactly what I'm talking about, you know that though you do everything you can, it sometimes isn't enough. And at that point, you get on your knees and you ask God, God, do the impossible in my life. My daughter is far from you. God, I don't know about my job. I've done everything I can. I'm leaving it in your hands, and you walk by faith, though everything around you says to quit, like Esther and Mordecai. How in the world could they ever go up against the second most powerful man in Persia? Only because they walked by faith, and they believed that we're going to do what we can. Esther and Mordecai believe we are going to do what we can, but we're going to leave the throw of the dice into the hands of God who can do impossible things. Things that are impossible with man are made possible with God. The disciples could not excise a demon from that poor boy. Why? They didn't believe they could. Though Jesus had ordained them, sent them out, gave them power over demons, they didn't believe they could do it. And here Jesus is now confronted with this boy, and he's upset. You want to know why he's upset? Why does Jesus say, "Oh, faithless generation, how long am I with you?" He's upset because the disciples should have been able to do this. But they didn't believe they could do this. They didn't believe in Jesus Christ's word to them. Listen, church, this is a message for no one in this room but me. Do you know how many times as your pastor I've sat in my office and I think, I cannot do this. I'm not smart enough. I don't know my Bible well enough. I'm not old enough. Why are people coming to hear me week in and week out? Don't they know who I am? And I look to the future. I look what God is doing. And we're going to talk about the business meeting in a couple weeks, how God is growing our church. And I look at what's happening. I think, you're doing this despite me. This is not at all me. And here, today, this week, I'm reading this, and God is chastising me, your pastor. Because he looks at me and he says, "Oh, faithless pastor, didn't you hear what I told you to do?" You're right, it's not about you. You're right, it's not about your ability to pastor them. It's all about me. You're right, Pastor Ben. You will do everything you can. You will work the hours, I know. You will put in the time to be their pastor. But I'm telling you right now, Ben, it's not going to be enough. It never has been enough. But then God steps in. And though I have toiled and worked and tried to think and tried to do and tried everything I can, he still steps in and makes up the difference. This message is for no one in this room but me today. I got on my knees this morning and I said, God, I don't want to ever be a disciple who you bring me a father with his son and I can say I can't help you. I don't ever want to be that disciple. So church, I have one question for you. Do you believe God can do the impossible? I hope so. Because here's the cold hard truth. If you do not believe that God can do the impossible, he won't. Father, I love you. God, you have preached this message to me today. How many times, God, I have felt the task before me was greater. And God, the funny thing is, it's true. Lord, the task before me is so much greater than me. But God, how many times have I allowed that to keep me from walking by faith? The trust that, God, you're going to move mountains. Lord, I am the faithless pastor this morning. I am. But Lord, as that father said once, I believe. Can you help my unbelief? God, I don't have a lot left. And Lord, what I see frightens me. It discourages me. Lord, it steals my sleep. Lord, I believe. Can you help my unbelief? Lord, I pray for that one here this morning, Lord, who wants to see you do the impossible. Lord, maybe they were like me, and they have given up hope. Lord, I don't know what impossible task they have in front of them, but Lord, I pray that, God, you would not allow my church to be discouraged by the impossible. Lord, but let us trust in the God of the impossible. Lord, you make possible what we think is impossible. God, move in a mighty way in our church and help our unbelief. I love you, my Jesus, and I thank you. And all God's people said, amen. Hey, church, I've said this every single time. I do love you. And if you want to talk with me, I want to talk with you. I'll be over here, but God bless you. You're dismissed.